Thank you for downloading this Real Agriculture podcast. Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Bio. Access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Learn more at excitebio.ca. That's XITEBIO.ca.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio.
Hi everyone, welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. I am your surprise host, Lyndsey Smith. That's right, Sean Haney was set to be in the host chair today, but had some challenging issues with trying to get to a desk. So he is traveling somewhere across America. Incredibly sad not to be here today. He's got so much he wanted to share about his travels this week and where he's been. But we'll just have to wait for Monday or Tuesday's show to hear about that, or maybe next Friday. But of course, we've still got the issues panel. And on today's show, you're going to hear from Meagan Murdoch, as well as Kelvin Heppner. And we are going to tackle all of the news that's happened this week. There has been a lot. We've got a Canada Post strike. We've got the strike at the ports that's been somewhat resolved, but not entirely. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of appointments happening in the U.S. with the incumbent president's new administration that Donald Trump is putting together. So there is so much to talk about. And I've got a question also about productivity that I'm going to pose to my panel guests. So we'll see how that goes. We've also got on today's show, we've got a product spotlight with Terry Drabiuk. He's with Genesis Fertilizers. So he's going to join us in the third segment today for today's show. As always, if you've got feedback on today's show, you can zip us an email. So I am at lsmith@realagriculture.com. Sean is at shaney@realagriculture.com. And of course, you can find us across social media, YouTube, X, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Real Agriculture is pretty much everywhere. And so if you've got feedback, if you've got a question, if you've got a story idea or a story lead, just let us know. Zip us a note. All right. I'm going to go to a quick break, and I'll be back to bring in the panel for this week's issues panel right after this.
There's power, and then there's superpower. Advancing the unstoppable superpower of pre-seed from New Farm. Take control. Eliminate weed competition and start clean in spring. Manage weeds early in canola, cereals, and pulses. Conquer Goldwing, Thunderhawk, and Blackhawk EVO. Convenient formulations and multiple modes of action. Add more power to glyphosate, more benefits to your burn down. Go to newfarm.ca/burndown.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
I'm Lyndsey Smith from RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights for The Agronomists, a 1-hour live and interactive show broadcast across YouTube, Facebook, and X. Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, I host expert agronomists from all over the country to give you answers to some of the toughest agronomic questions. Join us live or catch the replay Tuesday morning. That's The Agronomists with me, Lyndsey Smith, Monday nights live at 8 p.m. Eastern. Welcome back to Real Ag Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. I am your host for the day, Lyndsey Smith. And hey, Real Ag listeners, Cantera Seeds has 8 bags of their new CS 4100 Liberty Link canola available to be won by one lucky listener. Yes, this is for Real Ag listeners. Go to cantera.com/realag to find out more and to enter, because that draw is happening tomorrow. So get on in there. Do not delay. All right. It is Friday. It is time for the issues panel. I have with me Kelvin Heppner out of Altona, Manitoba, and with Real Agriculture, of course. How are you, Kelvin?
Doing well here, Lyndsey. It's our beautiful fall is continuing here in southern Manitoba, and I'm just thinking about those 8 bags of canola seed. Would somebody rather win that or tickets to that supposedly big famous singer that's performing in Toronto this week?
Well, as expensive as canola seed can be, the tickets
I was trying to do the math quickly.
to Taylor Swift, I think, are going to cost a little bit more. We are going to talk about that. And actually, someone who can hear the screeches of glee from her window is Meagan Murdoch with Hill and Knowlton. Welcome here, Meagan.
Hi guys. Nice to see you.
Mm-hmm. How is the zoo in downtown Toronto while Taylor Swift is in town?
Honestly, it's wild. It's wild. Everything kicked off last night. Fans are flocking to the city. There's not a hotel room to be found. Busy weekend here this weekend and then again next weekend, when many hopes will either be, met to see her or dreams dashed for those who weren't able to get tickets.
Mm-hmm. Now, Meagan, this is like, I'm seeing the numbers come in as far as the economic impact of, so this is 6 shows in Toronto. It's like the GDP of a small country, basically, for these 10 days or however long it's going to be. So my question is, how much did you rent out your apartment for?
Honestly, it's really wild. They're expecting, they say, 500,000 visitors in the city over these 2 weeks. And Destination Toronto, which is our local tourism agency, is estimating that the shows will create up to nearly $300 million in economic impact. So just think, the concerts are one thing, but all the restaurants, the hotels, the activities that are happening around it, it's a really, really big boon to the city. Of course, there's also costs with hosting this many people for 2 weekends. The economic impact is big. I should be renting out my place. If I could leave the city with my cat, I would, because I could probably make quite a bit. If anyone's out there still looking for a hotel room, I've got an air mattress with your name on it.
There you go.
Just $500 a night.
That's all. Yeah. If you want to use the bathroom, it's extra, but the mattress is $500 a night. Kelvin, you of course saved up all of your dollars and are there front and center this weekend. No, I'm just kidding. Kelvin, are you impressed by this, or does this drive you a little bit bonkers about the sequence?
I would rather take the canola seed, going back to that question. Definitely rather take the canola seed. To me, I understand the economic impact, but to me, the coverage of it is just over the top. We don't need to see aerial shots of her entourage driving down the highway, the freeway, and all. It's, I don't know. To me, it's just over the top. Her music's okay. She's a good entertainer. She's talented. She brings people together, maybe not politically, but in terms of her fans, obviously extremely popular. Those are all good things, but just to me, the coverage and attention to it is over the top. Let's talk about something that's more sustainable, not just something that brings business for 6 days or 10 days. So let's talk about things that structurally drive the economy and increase GDP.
Yeah, I mean, it does speak to supply and demand, doesn't it?
It really does.
Right?
There's all kinds of economic lessons.
Yeah, and she's been on tour for just about 2 years. These are some of her very last shows of this tour. I can't help but think about the calculations that are being done by her team and her business team about, how many shows can they supply in order to have peak demand, not oversaturate the market.
That's right.
But just make that right balance there where it drives the crazy just before she wraps this tour up.
Yeah. It's fan is short for fanatic, everybody. So Kelvin, not a Swiftie. We've established that. In our house, we listen to Taylor's version, and we are Swifties in this house. Chris will not say he's part of that, but The rest of us are. And we'll leave it at that. Anyway, so I am not going to the show, though. No one invited me. I didn't get tickets. That's fine. We'll just watch the Eras Tour movie. Because, of course, there's a movie. Okay. Switching gears, though, to much more serious things. Because a lot happened this week as well. And so to catch everybody up, maybe let's start with the bad news. So we have some good news on the ports. But on the bad news side, Kelvin, now we have our mail system going on strike. So Canada Post going on strike.
Yeah, this is the latest union that provides pretty essential service to the economy that is flexing its muscle here. As again, we continue to not see any political parties really standing up to union action, and so postal workers are on strike as of today. And earlier in the week, we saw Labour Minister Stephen McKinnon invoke Section 107 once again to get the ports running again in Vancouver, Montreal, Quebec, and up the West Coast as well, Prince Rupert included. And this is a really troublesome pattern in terms of this important economic infrastructure for, especially in agriculture and export-focused industry like we have, where we need the ports working, we need them running, and for government to have to invoke Section 107, this was basically unprecedented until this year. They did it with the railways when we had the dual railway strike in August, and that is being challenged in court. There are 4 different challenges happening right now with the Teamsters Union taking the government to court over invoking Section 107. And from people that we talk to, there is a high chance here that the government is going to lose these cases, and that the use of Section 107 could potentially, depending how the court rules, the Federal Court of Appeals and the federal court, it could actually throw these cases out, or throw these collective bargaining agreements out that result from government action here. And so there's potential for some major upheaval on the labor side of things with our essential infrastructure. And to me, we need to find a new system that all parties can agree on, where government doesn't need to be the last resort that has to intervene in all of these.
So politically, Meagan, as Kelvin notes, nobody really wants to take on a union at this critical juncture. We are within 12 months of an election, perhaps less, depending on who you talk to. Parliament is filibustered with a privilege motion. At some point, though, to Kelvin's point, these are going to make it through our legal system. It's entirely possible that whatever agreement gets tossed out and we're back at square one. Is this just kicking the can down the road for some other government to have to deal with? Or what happens next?
Yeah, well, there's always many cans to kick, whether it's this one or another one in 6 months. Any future government is going to need to deal with this. Certainly the government that I worked with faced strikes all the time and evoked emergency legislation to get them back to work. Under the Harper government, they forced many, I think railways probably at the time. I'm thinking about airlines. Yeah, exactly. I remember Lisa Raitt was a minister at the time at Transport and forced airlines to get back. So, certain governments take a different approach. I'm sure Pierre's glad not to have to manage this one in particular at the moment, because, every union worker is also a voter at the end of the day, but every government has to deal with this and has to strike the right balance between enabling them to negotiate fairly and finding the right time to intervene. It's not like this wasn't foreseen. So, you'd have to think that the current government saw this coming. We're nearing the holiday season, which is typically a great time for postal workers to strike because there's a lot of packages needing to get to different locations. So, let's hope that the mediator that they've appointed can find some sort of resolution so that the holidays aren't disrupted too badly.
Mm-hmm. Now, Kelvin, that does bring up, there's a difference between back to work legislation, of course, and binding arbitration. Walk me through that, because, of course, when Harper was in power, if you've got a majority, you can do something like that. But we're in a minority government situation. And as I mentioned, Parliament's not really functional right now. So was this the only option, was 107?
It's really the only option the government had in terms if it wanted to end the strike here. Yeah. And that's where this has kind of been unprecedented. They've kind of found a new tactic here in terms of ending these strikes. And in some cases, we know employers aren't dumb either. They know that if they force, and in this case, some of these work stoppages at the ports were actually lockouts, not strikes, and so the employers may be forcing the hand of government as well to intervene and step in. And so that's where, Section 107, the courts are going to have to decide whether the minister has the right to interfere with workers' right to collective bargain and strike, and that's something that the Supreme Court in Canada a few years ago ruled is right up there among the highest of rights of Canadians, the right to strike and the right to collectively bargain and the right to associate, or I forget the exact terminology, but that's something that the federal court now is going to have to decide, and that's where there is judicial risk here for industries that are relying on this Section 107 solution to these work stoppages. And we have heard from, I know last week, Lyndsey, you talked to Greg Northey with the Ag Transport Coalition and Pulse Canada, and so there are some ag industry groups that are starting to talk to other business groups about doing some heavy lifting here to try to get some of the process refined. Some of these steps, I think Meagan maybe alluded to this a little bit, or at least across my mind while she was speaking about this. Why don't we do some of these things before the actual shutdown of the critical infrastructure? If we know the timelines for these agreements, and we know it, let's set some dates. If 6 months out we don't have 98% of the agreement in place, government intervene at that point and get their mediators at the table and force some more action before the critical infrastructure shuts down. That's something that I think there needs to be some revamping of how labor law and how some of this unfolds in Canada.
Yeah. But it's all the levers, right, that they have within a negotiation. The timing of it is a lever in itself. So government would be reticent to intervene before absolutely necessary. Even though I like the idea, you're essentially moving the deadline up by doing that.
But it is.
If there's a way of not creating greater public good damage to the public interest, that's where I think government has a place to a justification for intervening. Then
fair. The pressure just wouldn't be built at that point, right?
Yeah, and Section 107 is kind of like a large sledgehammer, right, as opposed to a precision tool. So it sort of does hop over perhaps other options. But Meagan, you're exactly right. Even by putting, potentially different sort of deadlines in place, you really just move up the timeline for those pinch points more so than eliminate those things. But at the same time, like with this dual port lockout and or strike, we were looking at a loss of $1.2 million worth of goods, not moving per day.
Billion, I believe.
Sorry, billion. 1.2 billion with a B. So per day. And that, of course, so we talk about Canada Post.
A lot of Taylor Swift concerts.
Yeah, that is a lot of Taylor Swift concerts. But we talk about, Canada Post going on strike right in front of the holidays. This is also, of course, a lot of goods coming in from those ports that would be for the holiday season, also not moving. I do want to touch on just quickly before we go to a break, with Canada Post. This is one that has come up a couple times of, do we still need Canada Post? Do we still need daily mail during the week? Kelvin, is Canada Post putting themselves potentially out of business by doing this right before the holidays?
I always find these do unions have the self-awareness to realize that they also hurt demand and hurt their business model when they go on strike in some of these cases? I'm not sure they factor that into their equations, because in this day and age with email billing and online payment and all that type of stuff, how much business are you taking away every time you go on strike and people have to switch to online billing and that type of thing? You're hurting your own business model there.
Yeah. Well, the organization recently announced that they need to go to a mail every other day model in order to be self-sufficient. So it's not very surprising that the union is striking at this point, because you know what every other day model requires? Less delivery people.
Yeah. And that's every other day service is in the big cities. Here in rural Manitoba, we haven't had
already have that.
I was going to say every other day is kind of normal for some places, and I will say that is a key part, certainly for I'm very much like for people who perhaps have mobility issues or those sorts of things, because we've had this argument about house delivery versus whatever. Like I feel like we could make exceptions as opposed to blanket deliver to everybody and then people still have to work something out versus if I could opt into every second or third day, I would, because I don't need to get my mail every single day. And I think that that's probably the reality that Canada Post.
It's actually just junk mail anyway.
Well,
bills.
A lot of, also bills. I don't want those. Okay, we've got to take a break. We'll be back with the issues panel just after this break. We're going to have our product spotlight with Genesis Fertilizers, and then I'll bring the issues panel back in. We'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this. Make your neighbors envious with CDC NV CWRS. Introducing CDC NV CWRS, the latest wheat variety now available for Plant 25 from Alliance Seed. This semi-dwarf wheat delivers impressive yields, early maturity, outstanding standability, and a robust disease package. With CDC NV, your wheat crop will be the talk of the town. Learn more and find your nearest retailer at allianceseed.com or call 1-877-270-2890.
If you only listen to RealAg Radio, you only get half the picture. For greater insight into the issues that affect farming, tune in to RealAgriculture.com. Crops, livestock, machinery, farm management, and the markets, even food and travel. Real Agriculture Online digs deeper into the topics that affect the way you work and live. So get connected today. Read, watch, and listen to the people who know at RealAgriculture.com.
Peter Johnson at WheatPete, RealAgriculture.com. I'm the host of The Word, and I love doing The Word. I love the questions. I love the challenges. I love having to apply agronomics to all over the globe and areas outside of my normal jurisdiction. Also, I love the feedback the most, where growers challenge me, tell me about their plot results, help me to learn. The Word, absolutely the best part of my day.
I'm Lyndsey Smith with RealAg Radio, and joining me now with Genesis Fertilizers, it's Terry Drabiuk. Terry, welcome here. Tell us about what you do with Genesis Fertilizers.
Well, sure. I have. I wear many hats. I'm the Vice President of Business Development for Genesis Fertilizers, and I'm an Access Capital representative. So I'm licensed and registered to sell securities in every province across Canada. And I go out and talk to farmers to get them to invest in the project.
All right. Okay. So we are going to talk, of course, fertilizer cost today, fertilizer access. These are all important parts that the design of Genesis Fertilizers really hopes to address. So let's talk about the influence of NOLA as a pricing benchmark when it comes to fertilizer costs. And in what ways does Genesis Fertilizers aim to provide more stability for Canadian farmers with these price fluctuations?
Yeah, sure, Lyndsey. So NOLA is New Orleans, Louisiana, as I suspect most of your listeners would know that. And that's the benchmark for bringing fertilizer into North America. And it's all about price discovery of a commodity. So they use NOLA as the price discovery, and the further away you get from NOLA, the higher you pay for your fertilizer. So Western Canadian farmers pay the highest price for fertilizer on the continent, and in most cases, the world. Another key attribute of that is the price discovery of natural gas. So because natural gas is one of the biggest inputs at making nitrogen fertilizer, the price discovery mechanism in Western Canada is a company called AECO in Calgary, Alberta. Because of the glut of gas that runs off the foothills of Alberta throughout the prairies and the envious pipeline structure we have in Western Canada, everybody in Western Canada prices their gas off of AECO. Eastern Canada and the United States price their gas off of Henry Hub, which is priced off the NYMEX in New York, and Henry Hub is in Louisiana with the same thing as AECO, where they've got, a pipeline infrastructure that reaches most of the United States. The key, though, Lyndsey, is that the NYMEX or Henry Hub, they sell their natural gas in British thermal units in U.S. dollars, and AECO sells their natural gas in gigajoules in Canadian dollars, and so every single day, AECO's got a price advantage over Henry Hub, which means that the producers, and I mean the fertilizer producers, they sell at the highest price and they manufacture at the lowest cost. And that's the key about NOLA.
Okay, that is fascinating stuff and also really important to understand because, of course, we have to think about the logistics side, which is where we get to in our next question. So thinking about, obviously, where things are priced from, but also where things potentially travel from, that logistics question weighs in. How does Genesis Fertilizers' proposed model address the logistical challenges that Canadian farmers face, especially during those critical seasons?
Sure. There is very little product that comes from NOLA that hits Canada, mainly Ontario and Manitoba. But if it does, it comes from the river, Mississippi, up to, say, St. Louis, into a transfer terminal, into a rail car, from the rail car into a distribution house in Canada, and then distributed to retails. So lots of touch points and lots of costs. Genesis Fertilizers plans on building one plant, and that one plant is for Western Canadian farmers. So not only would the investors be entitled to the fertilizer that we produce, they would also profit from the fertilizer plant.
Okay. Now, in times of high demand, Western Canadian farmers often face price pressure from U.S. buyers because of that competition of NOLA-sourced fertilizers. How does Genesis Fertilizers plan to alleviate that competitive pressure and create more secure supply for Western farmers?
Well, we don't plan on lowering the price. So the model is around the investor farmers paying exactly what they would pay today. So we would be competitive in that high sales, low manufacturing costs. And we plan on giving the profit back to the farmer as close to the cost of production as we possibly can. So they're entitled to the product and they get the profit from the product. And we call it a closed loop system, which is actually really critical. And it's unlike any other model that you can see around the world, because as the owners, they're also the ones who will take the product from the plant.
Now, this is, of course, a project that we've been following closely here with Real Agriculture and on RealAg Radio, hearing from Genesis Fertilizers. For anyone who's interested, for more information, how they can invest, how Genesis Fertilizers plans to deliver this, where can they go for more information?
The best place is our website. It's genesisfertilizers.com. You can go on there and see the profiles of all the board members and senior management, like myself. And there's direct access, so you can email us or call us. It's just a click away.
All right. Terry, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, Lyndsey.
All right. We'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this.
If you're serious about agriculture, RealAg's got you covered.
For over 10 years, we've listened to and shared what producers have to say about everything from policy to agronomy from coast to coast.
Keep up with the latest in Canadian agriculture at RealAgriculture.com through daily newsletters and check out our YouTube channel.
Thanks for joining us in the RealAg community as we continue to cover and serve North American agriculture. There's a reason we call it the Corn School. Videos on everything from planter setup to weed control, field trial results, and the latest yield strategies. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from RealAgriculture.com, or as a podcast in your favorite podcast app. Check out the latest Corn School episode today.
Welcome back to Real Ag Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. Take your oat game to the next level with CDC Endure from Alliance Seed, one of the top yielding varieties in Prairie Provincial Yield Trials, available from authorized Alliance Seed retailers. Visit allianceseed.com for more information. All right, I am Lyndsey Smith, your host for the day, and joining me, Meagan Murdoch, Kelvin Heppner for the Issues panel. Kelvin, we had a story that has now proved true, but was somewhat kept under wraps last week, that our Ag Minister, Lawrence MacAulay, was headed to China. But this was somewhat secretive, but we now have visual confirmation that MacAulay did in fact go to China.
Yes. So we reported late last week, that Agriculture Minister Lawrence MacAulay was headed to China this week during the Remembrance Day break week from Parliament to deal with the possibility of retaliation against Canadian canola as part of the whole anti-dumping investigation that was launched after Canada imposed the tariffs on EVs and steel and aluminum batteries coming from China. And so his office, though, has gone completely quiet, and we are told that, or we believe that this is on direction from the Prime Minister's office, that they weren't supposed to acknowledge or talk about Minister MacAulay's trip to China. And so, yeah, we heard this from numerous industry sources. We were confident enough to report it that he was headed to China this week, but we didn't have a lot of details. And today we saw some evidence that he met with pork industry representatives from the Canadian pork industry in China today or in the last 24 hours sometimes. So that leads me to believe the meetings on canola are done already. And I think one of the reasons why the government wanted to keep this quiet is just the odds that this wouldn't be a successful meeting in terms of trying to stave off potential retaliation. There had been reports or talk of tariffs potentially being announced this week. We've been monitoring the Chinese government Ministry of Commerce's website. We haven't seen anything there in terms of canola retaliation being announced, but that's something that we're following right now. And we understand Minister MacAulay is, he's probably wrapping up his time in China right now. Could be headed home already. I'm not sure.
So Meagan, hypothetically, as a government, why do you think it would be a good idea to keep it under wraps that your ag minister was going to a gigantic economic superpower to visit?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts come to mind. So when I was working in government with the former Agriculture Minister, Jerry Ritz, and Jerry did a lot of travel to support trade efforts. We had just a rule, like you could not go and travel to another country on our taxpayers' dime if you were not, doing a constructive, efforts. You didn't have meetings arranged, many meetings arranged for that matter. And you had to talk about it. You had to be transparent. You had to share what you were doing, why you were doing it, and why, even the cost was taken on to do it. So that was a general rule when we were in government. A little different maybe with the current government, I'm not sure. But it is surprising, really, that any minister would travel to another country without being transparent about it. That said, there are certainly some political thoughts that I would have in terms of going to China right now and what that might or might not say about your government's interests in China or interests in, being a collaborative partner to China. There's probably many Canadians who would like Canada to not be very close with China. And then there's the agriculture industry that really relies on trade with China, particularly the canola and the pork industry. But I do wonder what took him so long then, if he was going to fight for Canada and to fight for our farmers. Kelvin, you mentioned he met with the Canadian pork industry in China. I feel like that could have been done in Canada, but that's neither here nor there. It is important to meet face to face, though there are many other ways to communicate with government leaders. And then, I do wonder why he was meeting with them this week and not 2 months ago when the tariffs were put in place. So many questions. There's probably, if Kelvin's sources are correct and that it came down from the Prime Minister's office, there's probably many reasons that don't quite align to how we would think about it in terms of the agriculture trade space. Maybe more.
I think announcing the trip ahead of time, there was also some concern that it might jeopardize the meetings or what would happen at the meetings if it received attention ahead of time. So, but they still haven't confirmed it now, or like we're still hearing from the Ag Minister's office, and usually they are, to their credit, quick to respond to us with this type of information.
Yeah, so it is
now when they go quiet.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head scratcher, and certainly I do understand that there is a risk of, you're right, of either the meetings not happening or perhaps they were planned and getting canceled, or maybe they don't go well. At the same time, I think a transparency part of this discussion is an important one, and the value of going there, and of course what's at stake is, I think, these are huge conversations. in some ways exactly that. Maybe you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. I think many Western Canadian farmers are wondering what the heck happens with these tariffs on canola, and some action absolutely needed. So we'll see what happens on this if we do see those tariffs come down anytime soon.
Yeah, and it's not like they were
away.
Yeah, it's not like they were rational tariffs, right? It was pretty clear why they were put in place. So going to have, a rational argument isn't really anticipated to, they're not going to turn around and go, oh, you're right, Minister MacAulay, silly us, like, let's take them off. That's not going to happen. There's no expectation of that. Of course, these meetings have to be very delicately handled. It's not a country where you can take, a North American approach of, being bombastic or loud or forceful in nature. They don't take well to that. I don't think we would have pre-announced any meetings or travel of that kind either. But certainly after the fact, you'd want to be clear about what you did, the efforts you made, what your steps are next, in any way you could communicate that, particularly to the stakeholders in the agriculture industry that are most impacted. Speaking of tariffs,
that might be the word of the week. Maybe last week as well, since the U.S. election has wrapped. But we also saw, Kelvin, Doug Ford, so my premier, Meagan's premier, deciding that perhaps Mexico is the bigger problem of the three of us here in North America, and maybe the U.S. and Canada should buddy up and tell Mexico to clean up their act. What's going on here? And is this a smart move by Doug Ford?
I think the proof will be in the pudding in the coming months, but I don't think it's a bad idea to throw this idea out there and have this option on the table and at least get Mexico get their awareness up that hang on, Canada's upset with us too. It's not just the U.S. and so we better start changing some of our things here. And of course, a lot of this has to do with China using Mexico as a backdoor into the North American auto market. And of course, Doug Ford, facing an election sometime in Ontario, wants to maintain that support from the auto sector and the strength in the auto sector in Southern Ontario as well. So I think that the political factors all have to be considered in this. But yeah, to put Mexico on the table and say, hey, why not let's just do a Canada-US bilateral? I don't think that's a bad proposal to have on the table right now in terms of it looks like CUSMA, the USMCA deal, is really in jeopardy here with renegotiation coming up in 2026, if not before that, with if the Trump administration implements tariffs and that type of thing. To me, our whole North American trading bloc here is at risk, and Mexico has shown repeatedly that they're not always a team player, that they don't have the same values as what Canada and the U.S. have when it comes to environmental standards, labor standards, and those types of things. And so, if Mexico is going to keep doing this, then let's talk. I know there are some things to be said about negotiating in a three-way meeting versus a two-way meeting that Canada and Mexico can work together to gain leverage against the U.S., but I think the cost-benefit analysis needs to be done there. Of course, the U.S. exports way more to Mexico than what Canada exports to Mexico, so I think in terms of that cost-benefit analysis, that's where the numbers would need to be run. I'd need to do some more research on that or see some research done by experts on that, but I think this is a scenario that is certainly on the table, and we saw in the last negotiation of NAFTA back with the previous Trump administration that at the time we had Jerry Dias from the unions often throwing ideas out that were kind of outside the political Overton window that Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau couldn't mention. I wonder if that's kind of the same thing here with Doug Ford being used kind of as a proxy. Hang on, this idea exists within the Canadian side. It's maybe not the official government position, but this idea is out there in the Canadian talking or expert area, or people involved, stakeholders are talking about this type of proposal. I think that's maybe a tactic here as well.
Meagan, is that it? Do you see that as maybe part of the play here? Is that the difference between bilateral and a trilateral meeting? Having three partners having to agree on something does complicate things, but it does potentially give critical mass to something like Canada and Mexico against the U.S.
Yeah, it was a good point made by Kelvin in that if there were ways that Canada and Mexico could leverage their power to negotiate with the U.S., there's a lot to be said for that. But it does add greater complexity to the deal. And I think probably where the Premier's head is at is that it is critical that we are able to renegotiate a deal with the U.S. We just saw This week, some data out from Trevor Toombs, who's an economic professor at the University of Calgary. He noted that in 2023, the real GDP per capita in the US was 43% higher than in Canada. And he estimates that going into this year, that gap will widen to almost 50%. And so what that does certainly for trade and the impact of potential tariffs by future President Trump is still yet to be seen. But there's certainly a lot of concern as to how the tariffs that he mused about during the election on China and Mexico will have negative spillover effects for Canada. So I think
country of origin labeling. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Meagan.
No, country of origin labeling is a great example. Of something that certainly the agriculture industry is watching very closely as to how that will be brought up again by the president.
And where Canada and Mexico have shared interests.
Yeah. But the premier's number one focus is certainly trade with Ontario. He has to be mindful that we probably bring in a lot of temporary foreign workers from Mexico for the produce, vegetable and fruit sectors here in Ontario as well. And Kelvin, you're giving him a lot of credit for potentially floating an idea. If there's one thing to say about the premier, his ideas are typically his own.
Yeah. Maybe that's going too far. But I do think there's also something to be said about speaking in the same language as the Trump administration and negotiating the same, like in terms of this transactional approach. And I think Doug Ford speaks that language and takes that approach to his politics and how he deals with issues that are relevant to his voters in the same way that Donald Trump and the people around
he sees it as very straightforward, right? If Mexico complicates it, let's just do a deal directly, right? Just get to it. He just wants to get the job done. He wants to make sure that it's in place. And as straightforward as you can make that, he'd probably be very open to that approach.
Mm-hmm. Will we take a federal approach to such things? We'll see. Okay. To be determined. We've got to take a quick break here on the Issues panel. We'll be back with more with Kelvin Heppner and Meagan Murdoch right after this.
Advanced canola trait technology is here. And it's soon to be the talk of the town. Optimum Glide delivers excellent yield potential and agronomic trait performance. Improved crop safety. Enhanced weed control. And a wider window of application. You're going to want to see this. Learn more at OptimumGlide.ca.
What were the issues in your fields this year? Did you do a soil sample? What is your soil sample telling you about some of the nutrient issues that you might be having going into next year? What herbicides did you use? What residues you might be concerned about? What weed issues did you have? What crop residues did you have? How well do you know your fields?
Get the answers to all the questions you have about your pulse crop at the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com. Welcome back to Real Ag Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. This segment is brought to you by Blackhawk EVO from New Farm. Blackhawk EVO is the next evolution in pre-seed burn-down herbicides. Powered by Duplasan, Blackhawk EVO delivers fast, flexible, and complete control of early germinating and winter annual broadleaf weeds. All right, we've got the issues panel here for our last segment. I've got Meagan Murdoch, Kelvin Heppner. I do want to sort of leap off where we left it off as far as the political wrangling that's happening, of course, south of the border, and what happens next in Canada, of course, is going to play a role. Before we talk about how farmers feel about a change in government, though, Kelvin, we do need to touch on at least what we know so far as Trump's picks for his cabinet. We know that some of the names are familiar. We've got Robert Lighthizer playing some role. I heard Zippy Duvall jumping around. And then, of course, we will probably have to mention RFK Jr. But maybe let's start with perhaps the less jaw-dropping of them, which is Lighthizer. So what do we know so far about the ag-related people that might be in Canada?
These actually haven't been announced yet. Lighthizer is that's being reported.
Around, yeah.
and it's highly expected that he'll be very influential on the trade side of things, potentially commerce or treasury. Those are posts that that there's talk that he's running for those instead of the USTR like he was last time. But likely that Lighthizer will be overseeing trade, and that if not him, then somebody that has worked close to him, one of his proteges, will be the U.S. trade representative going forward. So he likes tariffs. He wants broad tariffs, wants them quickly, all those types of things. He's written a book here since last serving as USTR, and we want a roadmap of what he plans to do. It's all in there, I think. We'll have to see whether he actually can implement all of that, but it's definitely a possibility this time around. In terms of the other cabinet picks, Agriculture Secretary, you mentioned Zippy Duvall. His name is in the running, but I've seen lists, and we had one on Real Agriculture last week too, with like 15, 20 different people still on it. So we don't know who the Ag Secretary will be yet. Kip Tom of Indiana is certainly one of the front runners there. Robert Kennedy Jr., RFK, had been mentioned because of all his campaigning around Make America Healthy Again and how that relates to food and what's in our North American food system. He has now been named as the appointee for health, and so it'll be the big question now is whether the Senate will approve all of the people that have been announced. We also saw the new EPA director announced, and he has a history of being opposed to the renewable fuel standard and biofuels, so that has implications for agriculture. Different ones on foreign affairs and other areas as well. We saw Doug Burgum from North Dakota, the governor of North Dakota, announce his interior yesterday. So yeah, lots, and all the big question is the margin in the Senate, I believe, is 52-47 for the Republicans, and so if there are 5 senators that go against the will of the president-elect, that is the big question, whether these appointees can all get through in terms of the confirmation, the vetting and confirmation process that will happen next year.
Meagan, knowing what we know about the last Trump administration, do you have confidence that there would be 5 senators that would go against the president-elect's will? Because I have my doubts.
Thank you. Yeah. I think we can all have our doubts. It's interesting to see who he's choosing this time around. It looks like he's choosing people that are very much aligned to his views this time around, that don't necessarily have experience or history in the types of roles that he's putting them in. So he's making a very potentially different choices than he made in the last administration in that regard. Certainly you mentioned a few of the very interesting ones. I think there's a few others that give me even greater pause to a degree. Christine Noem, who's Homeland Security Secretary. I don't think you mentioned her, Kelvin. Right. This one is the woman whose book was released during the campaign and who had a full chapter on how she killed her dog. Yep. That was interesting. Elon Musk is the co-head of a new department called the Department of Government Efficiency. Essentially, he will fulfill a promise that I guess Trump made to have him review how the government spends money. So he will be co-head of that department. I thought that might be something that would be interesting to a future conservative government here as well. Mm-hmm. We had a red tape cutting plan under the Harper government. I thought that would be interesting to see where could we actually make government more efficient in the future. I don't know if you mentioned Todd Blanche in your list there. He's one of the defense lawyers who oversaw Trump's legal defense against multiple indictments. So he will be the number 2 Justice Department official. And that really is appointed rebuke of the criminal cases against Trump. So he's choosing people that are very, very close, Lyndsey, that I don't think would take a different opinion to him.
Absolutely not. And so now it could be that senators, of course, don't agree with these appointments, and they would, Kelvin, as you pointed out, potentially not approve these picks. I did want to point out Elon Musk, as you said, with the Department of Government Efficiency's DOGE, is what that acronym is, for anyone who follows along with Elon Musk. And also, it's about efficiencies, but there's 2 people. Not just
right.
So ironic.
And that's not a cabinet post. That's one that doesn't need to be.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that is, I think, for our Canadian listeners who maybe don't follow this along very closely, this is a pretty complicated, for some people, they love this. If Sean was here, he'd probably go on a 5-minute discussion on each of these people. We of course sit back and sort of watch a little bit. Obviously, some of these appointments have a phenomenal impact on policy, on agriculture policy, on trade policy going forward. So it is really important to understand potentially what we're getting into, because we need to be prepared for the kind of people that we're going to be up against, or the kind of policies potentially that we are going to have to work with and be partners across the border. And so to that end, I guess, as we left off the last segment, Kelvin, thinking about, Ford's way of sort of saying, hey, let's just get a deal done. Let's talk in real terms here. As these people are lining up, we know they're not confirmed yet, but the ones that, probably will be. And as this is lining up, we asked farmers if they're ready for a change in our own government. They are. They would like to see that. They think that's good. That's part of the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index. Which leader do you think, if you had to choose between Poilievre and Trudeau, is going to be better set to go up against a second Trump administration?
I think a change in government would be beneficial for Canada's trade interests, because we can say that the Liberals under Trudeau performed relatively well in the previous CUSMA USMCA negotiation, but they were new, filled with energy, filled with ideas, filled with staffers that knew what they were doing. Their bench is thin and tired, and in so many ways, I think they are running on fumes, and I don't think we're in a great position with the Liberals leading us into. And they had a United Team Canada approach. They had a majority government at the time, and all of those things are not around this time around at this moment. And the people we've talked about here, Robert Lighthizer is one of the few people that has a connection to Canada or has relationships. I know sometimes we put too much weight into those personal relationships, but Chrystia Freeland and Lighthizer have connected and have been talking here over the last week or two already about the future of the trade relationship between Canada and the US. But we don't have many of those relationships anymore at this point. And so to me, the change to a conservative government could also be beneficial in going back to what we said about Doug Ford. Pierre Poilievre will talk about protecting Canadian jobs, and that's something that he has focused on in the past, and that's language that Donald Trump understands as well. And so when Poilievre speaks in that language, I think Trump will in some ways respect that. And so I think we've started to see the Conservatives roll out that type of messaging here the last week or two since the U.S. election as well. And so I think just the change in government, bringing that new energy and new ideas and people excited about their role, I think is something to be said about a change in government being beneficial in this as well.
I am still thinking through the implications of a Trump presidency and how that may encourage, or I think potentially dampen interest in having a conservative government here as well. I don't think it will be enough to change the trajectory with which we're on. I certainly think a conservative government is coming, but I think it will be interesting to see certainly what actions Trump takes in between January and the next election, and how that may, sway or persuade voters here north of the border. We do pay a lot of attention to American politics and American news. So I think that will be something worth watching in 2025.
Well, and we've already, Well, I was going to say we've already seen the Liberals sort of trying to play that card 100%. Of like, Pierre Poilievre is another Trump and that's bad. So, I think that it probably doesn't, play well necessarily, depending on which angle you're coming from. Kelvin, go ahead.
Is there going to be a temptation, or I'm assuming there is already this temptation for the Liberal leadership and the Prime Minister's office, Justin Trudeau, to be the anti-Trump character on the global stage? And I think that could potentially be quite dangerous to Canada's economic prosperity in the future.
Well, and Kelvin, and we do have to wrap this up, but that is, I think, one of the key things here is that while there is so much hot air and political wrangling happening in Ottawa right now, ultimately, we are talking about very large decisions and trade deals and policies that have real economic impacts to the average Canadian, either immediately or down the line. And we need people at the helm that are taking care of Canada as a whole, not just whether or not they get reelected. This is pretty darn important. So we'll leave it at that. I've got to wrap up the show. Thank you, Kelvin. Thank you, Meagan, for joining me. Thank you all out there for listening. I'll be back for Tuesday's show, and don't worry, Sean Haney will be back for Monday as well here on Real Ag Radio. So have a wonderful weekend, Meagan and Kelvin.
Thanks. Nice to see you guys.
Thank you. We miss singing happy birthday for Meagan.
That's right. Okay. We'll do that offline next time. Okay. All right. Cheers,
Thanks,
everybody.
Guys.